was 11, I heard about the death of a man named Stanley Kubrick. This was in 1999. Having expressed what was at the time a nascent interest in film, my parents told me, you'd probably be into his movies. I don't know what that says about me as an 11-year-old, or really them for that matter, but I took it upon myself that spring to immerse myself in his catalog. Cinemax had interrupted their typically saucy nighttime programming to do a retrospective on Kubrick. Dr. Strangelove, Full Metal Jacket, 2001: A Space Odyssey. That week was one of the most formative experiences of my life. Not just because I thought, Jesus Christ, what am I watching? And not just because that reaction made me want to be a filmmaker right then and there, and still does. But it was then that I developed a myth. The myth of the auteur. He was often depicted as being incredibly scrupulous and often controlled every minute aspect of the production, perhaps assuming multiple roles. His one Oscar, which, talk about a snub, was awarded to him in 1969 for supervising his own visual effects in 2001: A Space Odyssey. This guy could and did do it all. In a conversation with Robert Emmett Gimma on the just innumerable aspects involved with making a film, he said, I think the fragmentation of these jobs by different people is a very bad thing. Then, some years later, I discovered another filmmaker whose work was just as influential to me. His name was John Cassavetes. He directed such films as A Woman Under the Influence, Faces, Opening Night, and in a way, he's the anti-Kubrick. He's the great collaborator. His techniques were all footed in the group effort. This is a 1993 interview with actor Peter Falk, which is kind of a bummer that up until then I only knew him as that guy from Corky Romano. He had this to say about starring in his 1969 film, Husbands. His dream would be to have everybody in the film do everything, to take turns handling the camera, acting, to write scenes together, but he had difficulty because it was his vision. So now, here's a guy whose ideology is so strong in the other direction that it creates friction with the outcomes that he wants. Up until then, I had a very narrow mentality. The idea that the lens we peer through when we look up at that screen is the eye of the master and no one else. You think of the film term auteur, as it was first introduced by the staff of Cahiers du Cinéma, a 1950s French film periodical. It literally means author. To them, the director is the author of the film. And the product, whether he or she wrote the script or not, becomes a mere vessel for their vision and the choices they made to convey it. This threw me for a loop. Now there were two concepts at odds, both with equally rich results. The Autocrat, who looks to himself, and the collaborator, who looks everywhere else. Do both fall under the title of auteur? Is either Kubrick or Cassavetes any less an auteur because of their process? If your inspiration comes from an inner monologue or an open dialogue, does either one make it any less original in expression? But all right, how does this relate to me? I don't make films. I don't instruct leagues of people. I'm a solo artist, a musician, meaning that I mainly work alone. When I first started making music, I didn't know anything about it. I initially did it out of the frustration I had with the film program at my college, which at the time wouldn't let you check out a camera until you were a junior. Wanting to have some creative outlet, I said, all right, namaste. I don't need a crew and an equipment to make music. I already have a computer. Wasn't the best idea for my grades, but tomato, tomato. So I had to approach it through something that I did know about then, which was filmmaking. And since then, I've never gotten out of that analogy. Why is this important? Because this dichotomy over the meaning of the word auteur that I've been mulling over since I first wanted to make something was completely transformed by music. I learned that these two ideas weren't mutually exclusive. I'm an autocrat by default. Solo artist, right? Wrong. We put all this pressure on ourselves to only look within for ideas because we think that's the meaning of original. The truth is, nothing is original. Everything comes from something, and to me, creativity is either conscious or unconscious collaboration. I'm a collaborator, and through the ongoing life of Neon Indian, I've been able to define what collaboration means to me, even when I work alone. But okay, first, why do we celebrate the Autocrat? More people know Kubrick than Cassavetes. Why? Well, perhaps one reason is because the Autocrat is romanticized. We like to say great art comes from one mind. Original thought, right? Like the auteur's ideas just materialized in a void. It's why no one ever sits through the credits. We all want that one big name right when the movie's over so you can say, okay, got it, and then get to your car before you're stuck in the parking lot. And there's even more radical examples of this in music. Let's talk about DIY in electronic music and the funneling of creative tasks to one hand. This is a quote pulled from the documentary Made in Sheffield. It's by Philip Oakey of the Human League. We thought we were the punkiest band in Sheffield. We were laughing at the bands that learned to play guitars because they bothered learning 3 chords. We didn't even do that. We just used 1 finger. If this sounded like a radical coup on the facility of making music in the modern age, let's put it into context that he first had this thought at least 37 years ago when they put out their first single in 1978. The current climate of independent music has taken this sentiment exponentially further. It has become easier and easier to do it yourself. You could argue that the learn 3 chords and start a band ideology behind punk was reborn in the mid-2000s. But instead of a beat-up guitar and a pawn shop amp, you've scored a copy of Ableton Live and a secondhand laptop. We thought DIY empowerment was punk. Now we are literally doing it all ourselves. And there's more solo artists now because of these developments. You can be not just the composer, but the producer, the engineer, the mixer, the performer. In other words, the Autocrat. If Stanley Kubrick was a 20-something-year-old in Bushwick making electronic music, he would be in hog heaven. He would have true control over his art. And I've met a few of those Kubricks. They all have that same beard as him. Some could argue that by not siphoning those tasks to other people, it can often create a more singular aesthetic because every aspect of a song's conception is being shaped by one person and their sensibilities. So you're in a better place to be an original, right? Nobody in the room but you and probably your cat if you're making electronic music. Well, that's only one side of the coin. If this explosion in independent output gives us a greater chance to be original, then why is music becoming more and more referential? Why is it getting harder to be a distinct voice in all that noise? Every time someone introduces something new into the musical conversation, it then becomes something that will now be derivative for future iterations. There's only so many notes in a scale. If we're just talking about pop music, then we're already nearly a century into this process. And music is topical. So we exhaust the variations on a trend faster than in any other medium of art. SoundCloud, where pop stars and unknown experimentalists alike post their new jams, uploads an average of 12 hours of new music every minute. That's 17,280 hours of music every day. That is so much. It would take you nearly 2 years of nonstop listening just to get through one day. It's an arms race for originality. So is the history of everything just staring us down when we want to say something new such a bad thing? No. Not if you understand that all of this is now at your disposal. Consider the Homeric tradition of storytelling, where the concept of author essentially didn't exist yet, and stories were just a generational game of telephone, evolving and being added upon until eventually being documented with the development of an alphabet. History, with all her volumes, hath but one page. You like that? I didn't write that. I'm not that smart. George Gordon Byron said that. If nothing is original, then steal everything. And don't be ashamed. Absorb anything within arm's reach and let your mind tell you what it wants to do with it. Remember when I said creativity is either conscious or unconscious collaboration? Let's talk about the unconscious. All right, here's my attempt at the TED Talk Science Minute. There's a part of our brains called the Limbic System, which is concerned with taking all the information our sense organs are collecting every moment of our waking lives and determines what of it is salient by assigning emotions and associative memories to it. Those limbic functions are happening all the time, whether we are aware of it or not. Have you ever had a song idea stuck in your head that you were positive you came up with, only to find out that it was something you heard on the radio? Imagine recording that song. Our subconscious minds are essentially collaboration machines. We are collaboration machines. Inspiration is just that connection to that ineffable part of ourselves that is constantly assembling and synthesizing the things it finds important to create an overall impression of what speaks to us. So in a way, influence is inevitable. The only original thing here is you, your unique configuration of your past, your tastes, influences, and skills. That's what takes that page of history and scrambles the words to form a new sentence. And when you do, put your name on it, because you're the author now. Creativity can't exist in a vacuum, unless, of course, you came from space, in which case, you are David Bowie. And that considered, allow me to blow your mind. This is a quote from David Bowie in a 1976 September issue of Playboy, in which Cameron Crowe asks him if he considers himself an original thinker. No, by any means. More like a tasteful thief. The only art I'll ever study is stuff that I can steal from. That resonates with me. That's that conscious collaboration. And when you work alone, it happens through appropriation. It's how I made my first record, Psychic Chasms. See, the referential nature of music never bothered me. In fact, I wanted the record to play with that idea. Narratively, I wanted it to feel like a snapshot of that time in my life and talk about the things that happened to me through the music that I was obsessed with at the time. I wanted to insert myself into those eras of sound I was exploring, as if in a film score. For example, the main single, Deadbeat Summer, I imagine is that scene where the day is sweltering and the protagonist muses spending it in a lovesick stupor while Todd Rundgren plays in the background. I was listening to him heavily at the time, so it felt autobiographical. I wound up taking a small one-bar iteration of his music and building off of it, much in the way that a guitar player might throw you a lead to write chords around. I was pretending to be in a band with my hero. This was also the case for Terminally Chill, my second single. Why not be in a band with my Italian disco favorites, La Bionda, I thought. I could grow a mustache. I probably look pretty on point in polyester. And it went on like that. There's a term for this. It's called sampling, and it's found in nearly every iteration of electronic music. I had simultaneously become Autocrat and collaborator, some mutant amalgamation, working alone externally, but having an epic rager in his head. There must be a term for that too. What about Auteur? I'll let the French decide. And there's a long line of appropriators like me. Negativland, De La Soul, Jay Dilla, Emergency Broadcast Network, the Beastie Boys, the Avalanches. These are just a few people who can build entire albums out of samples to make something more beautiful and strange than the sum of its parts. They're collage artists, essentially. The Hannah Hodges of music. The most prime example of this would be Daft Punk, who started out by celebrating their heroes through sampling their works and coming full circle a decade later to actually writing an album with them in Random Access Memories. Don't say you were touched by the hand of God. Say you were touched by the hand of Giorgio Moroder. We all stand on the shoulders of our idols, and if we're really lucky, one day we get to feel the weight of our influence on others. I think a lot of great artists understand this. George Lucas was heavily influenced by Akira Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress when he made Star Wars. Was Akira Kurosawa bummed that he appropriated the plot points? No. Here's them hanging out. Lucas is like, I appropriated your story. And Kurosawa's like, I know, I'm perfectly aware of that. And what's funny that no one ever brings up about Kubrick, he never wrote an original screenplay. They're all adapted from novels. But Kubrick gets the credit. They say he's the genius. And he is. So celebrate influence. Or as Sonic Youth would say, kill your idols. Or as John Fox had draped over his studio, destroy all masterpieces. Me talking about this isn't even a new thing. Fellow Texan Austin Kleon wrote a whole book on creative theft called How to Steal Like an Artist. And you know what? I'll celebrate one publicly now. I'm going to leave you with this quote from a 2003 issue of Filmmaker magazine with Jim Jarmusch beautifully summarizing everything I've been talking about. Now, it's a really long quote, so I'm going to let you read it. And my Jarmusch impersonation is no good, so. It's not where you take things from, it's where you take them to. That extra quote at the end makes this whole thing triple meta. I'm a guy who's quoting a guy who's quoting a guy. When you stop thinking about the author and start thinking about the art, it frees it up to be greater than the sum of your contributions. In any case, despite where in the spectrum between Kubrick and Cassavetes you seem to fall under, the auteur is in the ether and nothing more. Thank you.